to Mastering PRESUB, FDA pre-submission for the medtech industry. I'm really excited. This is truly a masterclass in FDA communication with our expert, Michelle Lott from leanRAQA. We have a great program lined up for you today. There's going to be some poll questions. Feel free to use the chat. If you have questions, please submit them. Not saying that we're going to get to them today, but we'll try to follow up with everyone. Yeah, let's go ahead and kick it off. Michelle, it's over to you.
All right. There we go. Okay. Are we, you can see my screen and everything? Okay. So today we're going to talk about a pre-submission masterclass. You guys probably all know me by now, but I've been in RAQA for over 20 years. I've assisted more than 150 companies, but I've also been on the FDA Good Manufacturing Practices Advisory Committee. I served a term as the industry representative there. This is my executive team. So today we're going to go through a crash course in pre-submissions. We are going to also cover different types of Q submissions like the 513G, the Breakthrough Device Request, the Safer Technologies Program, and lessons learned. And hopefully at the end of the course, you'll be able to differentiate between them and what's the best to use for your purpose. So let's get started with pre-submissions. So pre-submissions can be a really powerful tool, and the opportunity to ask very specific questions of the FDA and make the FDA really more of a partner to you than an adversary. So it kind of gets them involved early on in your technology as part of the problem-solving team about how is this product going to move through the FDA. They're really valuable if you have anything new or novel about your technology, especially if you are trying to get something that's similar but different from your possible predicate through the FDA via 510K. Oftentimes, FDA has got maybe draft guidances, or maybe there's something political happening behind the scenes. Could also be other devices are about to be cleared or granted a de novo. There can be things happening that you don't have visibility to that will reflect FDA's current thinking that may give you a challenge when you are in submission if you haven't had a pre-sub to learn what those things are. And so, of course, having this kind of inside perspective is going to help make you more successful in your submission. It's also important to know that these are non-binding technically, but the FDA does intend to honor them, their opinion, if their current thinking has not changed between your pre-sub and your submission. Most importantly, it is still free. So it's free, and they're pretty good about hitting their timelines. So there's really nothing lost by doing your pre-submission. So we talked about this. If you have anything that's new or novel, any first of its kind, that can be more than just a technology. That can also include expanding an indication or a patient population. I work with a lot of devices where they want to make them specific to pediatrics. FDA does consider that a new indication. And then while they are non-binding, you have to, the FDA will remember them. And so if you make changes between the time you do your pre-submission and the time that you go into your submission, you still need to address those questions in the pre-submission, even if they're not relevant anymore because of the changes you made to your product or indication. You need to say that and address them directly, or the FDA will ask you. So this is an opportunity to build your story and a true story to the FDA and inform them and help formulate their position in their review. So this is, again, an opportunity to tell a story around your product. So creative writing is very critical task to the pre-submission. You need to focus on 3 to 4 critical topics in a single pre-sub. Now, even though these might be only 3 to 4 questions, they could be multi-part questions associated with a single or specific topic. You need to be straightforward. Your questions don't need to be open-ended. They need to almost make a statement and then ask for FDA's concurrence. And don't include everything under the sun in your submission as far as the context or background, but make sure that you balance that to where the FDA isn't overwhelmed with data or information, but they've got enough information to thoroughly understand the questions you asked.
Let's go ahead and do poll number 1, we may.
Sure.
Can everybody see that? Can you see it, Michelle? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, good. So the question is, are you planning to do an FDA pre-submission in the next 12 months, including pre-submission 513G breakthrough or safer tech program? Yes, no, or uncertain. So you can keep going if you want. We're just going to let this run for a little bit.
Okay. So common topics for pre-submission include asking specific questions about your regulatory strategy. Again, particularly if you have anything new or novel or different from your predicate. The regulatory pathway, if your device doesn't fully fall in, you're not sure if it fully falls in a particular maybe product code or how the FDA would feel about your predicate strategy compared to a de novo. It is also very helpful to get buy-in from the FDA if they agree that you're significant risk or non-significant risk in your overall clinical strategy. And then also to ask specific questions about your plan performance testing, about both the plan and then in the future, the protocols. And then again, this is a way for FDA to get familiar with your technology. So just that background in your technology will help FDA advance your submission more efficiently through the agency.
So it looks like over half of the attendees are planning on doing a submission this year. That's great news. So I'm going to close the thingy. Let me know when it goes away.
Yep. So I mentioned that pre-submissions can be, a little bit of creative writing. Again, you're telling a true story, but the way you phrase your questions is really critical to your success. So you need to focus your efforts on issues that are most relevant to moving your project forward for the phase that it's at. You need to ask clear and objective questions. And this is important because I see a lot of people that are in love with their own science and technology, and you don't need to be making assumptions that FDA is going to think the same things as you do about your product or your technology and its needs in the marketplace. You need sufficient background and information and supporting documents and avoid the extraneous information that can be counterproductive because it's easy to maybe distract the FDA if you inundate them with information. And then your questions need to guide FDA to a desired outcome. So it all comes down to the power of phrasing, and there are ways that are most productive to ask questions. For example, if you include protocols and ask questions on strategy. An example of this would be, does FDA agree that the non-clinical test strategy is sufficient to demonstrate performance evaluation for the proposed device? But you don't ask the FDA to review actual data. They will not review data in a pre-submission. So for example, does FDA agree that my data is sufficient for a pre-submission? I have seen companies, particularly companies that are outside of the US, that might have already done studies for one purpose or another in another country. And they did the study without getting FDA to review the protocol in advance to see if FDA would acknowledge the results of that. And they're like insistent on turning that in their pre-submission, and FDA just, shuts that down very quickly, and they will not look at data. So even if you're going to do OUS studies or testing, I would still submit the protocols in advance to make sure you can get the most mileage and reuse out of data that you may obtain prior to going into your FDA submission. So also you can ask specific questions on the suitability of maybe your study or test design. So does the FDA agree that statistical sample size calculation method of the statistical analysis plan is appropriate for the proposed clinical study? As opposed to asking the FDA a question around your study or test protocol that may be more open-ended, and just ask the FDA what they think, like how many subjects should my clinical study have? I see this a lot with people who just randomly pick a number. Like they'll say, is 100 people enough for my clinical study, without including that statistical analysis of how did they come to that number. They just kind of picked the number out of the hat and thought FDA would validate it. So there are several ways to get feedback. You can get feedback, written feedback only. You can get teleconferences, or FDA is now back to in-person meetings. Now, the differences here is that, written feedback only, you are going to get a letter from FDA that's actually very comprehensive. They're going to thoroughly answer each question you asked. And then in written, I've had a lot of luck with written feedback only, where they said, we're going to answer your questions, but here are some additional things we're thinking, or questions we may have, or point you towards specific guidance documents for your consideration. And to me, written feedback only is often the best place to start, because it's a more comprehensive response. It's written in FDA's own words. Whereas with both the teleconference and in-person meetings, you're going to get a limited amount of written feedback in advance to help prepare you for the meeting, but it's not going to be to the extent that written feedback is. And in both the teleconference and the in-person meeting, somebody on your team is going to have to take notes in their own words of how they heard and interpreted the FDA. Then you're going to have to submit those notes to the FDA for their concurrence, and then for them to do the final edits. I see all the time that people that are taking notes and then submitting minutes, the FDA says, oh, that's not what we said, or that's not what we meant, and will make corrections. So at least for that first round of interaction with the FDA, it can often be helpful to ask that written feedback, because for all three of these, you've got an opportunity to ask clarification questions after you've had the initial feedback or meeting. So an example of, there was one where I had written feedback only. It had pretty extensive feedback in the written feedback only, but we could tell that the FDA had misunderstood an aspect of the technology. So I just submitted an informal email to the reviewer, and I said, hey, we want to clarify these points. Does that change your written feedback? And I got a response in email through an informal discussion that was as comprehensive as my written feedback only. So just know that there are all those kind of dynamics in play around why you pick what type. So another advantage of having a teleconference or a meeting is, or at least an in-person meeting, is that you've got the advantage of seeing the body language of the FDA, which can kind of help maybe read how they're positioning. On teleconferences, you may or may not, people may or may not have their cameras on, but also know that with teleconferences and meetings, that these are hard stops at 60 minutes. So you've got to manage this on the nose to make sure that you're very efficient with your communication. So you can dive deeper and get a broader perspective, because FDA is going to come with a legion of people for these meetings. And you might get a verbal perspective from a couple of different perspectives. And so this is great to capture maybe some more nuanced information, or for FDA to speak, verbally speak things that might have been difficult to convey in writing. So recently, FDA has launched the Prestar. It is still voluntary, but for you to be able to submit your pre-submission to the FDA, there's a section you can either request submissions, or request a meeting, or request written feedback, depending on your selections from the drop-down menus. And then that starts to open up or close down different elements of the Prestar template. So for those of you who don't know or haven't worked in it, Prestar is an interactive PDF form intended to be a dynamic PDF that can automate the submission process, because it predefines the content and structure, and it is complementary to the CDRH internal review templates. And then it also integrates multiple FDA resources like guidance documents, databases, help text, and then it guides you through the construction for each section of the submission. And then at the end, it has an automatic verification where you can tell, did you fully complete the sections in a way that the FDA might perceive them as technically complete as well. And so it'll go from red to green. You have to have a specific software and operating system configurations. You have to have a PDF editor like Acrobat Pro, and Windows or Foxit. And mandatory that as of October 2023, FDA is only accepting 510K submissions via the eStar format. And right now, pre-submissions, 513Gs, de novos, and PMAs are still voluntary underneath the eStar, but pre-submissions I anticipate are going to be the next that are going to be required in the eStar Prestar template, followed by 513Gs. So the advantages of Prestar for the FDA is that it's to enable more efficient and consistent reviews. Again, your information that you submit in your Prestar template is supposed to get uploaded and integrated to their internal, it's called Smart Review Template. And it's supposed to increase the productivity and the evaluation of applications for devices that pose the highest potential risk to patients. And then importantly, it fulfills a MDUFA commitment that the FDA made to ensure patients have more timely access to safe and effective devices. And it's supposed to do that by making the streamline that initial process and the initial the way that the FDA internal process works.
Could we take a
So,
do the second poll question?
sure.
So, one person asked for a certificate of attendance or completion of the webinar. I thought that was a nice idea, so we're going to go ahead and make a certificate. If you drop your name and email address into the participant chat, I'll make one for you as well. Please write your name the way that you would like it to appear. I thought that was kind of a neat idea. So the second question is around your program experience. Have you previously completed FDA pre-submission? And like no is pulling ahead. Michelle, I'll let you keep talking.
Okay. So again, the Prestar template aligns with FDA internal review templates. And the one nice thing about it is that it integrates the guidance document expectations. So it's got drop downs that include help text. So once you fill in and you get some sections opened up and maybe you're not sure what they mean by that question, you can click the help text. They'll give you an overview of their expectation, and then often they will point you to a specific guidance document if you have additional questions about that, about where did that question come from, or you need additional context. Okay, it looks like close to 60% have not done a pre-submission before, so that's great. We're getting a lot of background context here, and then we're going to go into some more specific examples. So hopefully this will all be helpful. Another helpful thing is that the Prestar has error messages that pop up if the responses don't make sense. So maybe you answered a question earlier on that you didn't have software, but then later on you talk about wireless technology. And so it says, like, maybe you indicated that your system had wireless technology, but you didn't indicate it has software. So these things are a disconnect to the FDA within this template. So it kind of really helps pre-screen for the FDA that the submission is complete, which is why they don't have the refuse to accept process anymore, though they do have a technical documentation review. So once you select early on in the template, you have to tell it what topics that you want to ask questions about. And you can notice that they have said select up to a maximum of 4 topics, which I think is interesting, because in that pre-submission guidance document, or the PRESUB guidance document rather, that discusses pre-submissions, they do recommend like a handful, these 3 to 4 questions. Then you pick which areas you want to ask the questions in, against which topics. So all that kind of lines up with the expectations there. So the FDA, it also automatically generates applicable guidance documents. So once you put in the classification information that you believe is pertinent to your device, say in this case, we have an infusion pump we want to ask about, well, then it will open up a new section and it says, hey, this product code has this product specific guidance document in it that you need to be aware of, that you're also that you will need to be able to answer questions about from a technological perspective. So you select your application type. Again, you can request the written feedback or the meeting initially based off of that first drop down. And then later on, when you start filling in your questions, it's going to ask you to identify per question what topic category from that initial 3 or 4 topics that you selected would be appropriate. So you can see how selecting different information earlier on, is going to affect the formatting and options that you have available in the rest of the Prestar template. So weaknesses of the Prestar template, signatures are complicated because oftentimes you will have several different people that need to sign, and the person that is compiling the pre-submission may or may not be the official correspondent for the company or the person that needs to make certain declarations. I have had people that just still physically sign a piece of paper, scan it, and upload that as their signature, which defeats a little bit of the electronic purpose of the STAR templates. So also, and this is a big one, in practice, file collaboration is likely has got to occur out of Prestar because the Prestar template does not track changes. File sharing of the Prestar template is extremely difficult. You have to upload and download, and it takes a long time, and there's a lot of information for a lot of opportunities for information to be lost. And then if you rely on that iterative editing or editing with multiple people across your organization, that using this solely the Prestar is complex and difficult, not only because it doesn't track changes, but in areas where you need to enter maybe long sections of information, like maybe the device description, the actual box that's available for you to view that text is only about 3 or 4 lines, and you've got to scroll and scroll and scroll to be able to read the whole section, because you're only going to be able to read 3 sentences at a time or 3 lines. So let's look at the time frames. So it starts with the FDA's receipt of the submission. They are going to either do a refuse to accept or a technical review, because remember, Prestar is still optional. So if you do a traditional e-copy, they will still do a refuse to accept. But if you do a Prestar, it still goes through what's called technical review, about do they believe that you answered your questions correctly and that the attachments appear to go with the questions where they expect attachments. Between day 30 and 40, if you have requested a teleconference or in-person meeting, they're going to reach out to you to schedule it. Then by day 70, you should have your FDA initial feedback if you're going to have a meeting, or your written feedback is due by day 70 and due in full. Now, one thing that's important, like FDA does run pretty close to their predicted timelines for pre-submissions. By day 75, you should have your meeting with the FDA conducted and done. At this meeting, you're going to take your notes. And then by day 90, you are going to provide those notes and the minutes to the FDA for their final edits and approval. And by day 120, the FDA will give you your revisions to the meeting minutes if needed. If you accept their revisions, there is no further communication unless you guys go back and forth with the edits to or revisions to the meeting minutes. So just notice, especially if it's your first pre-submission, this whole timeline to getting, FDA concurrence on everything that happened. If you get written feedback only, for certain at day 70 about where they're standing, and you still have opportunities to ask clarifying questions. Whereas, it's not till day 120 that for certain FDA's stance and how to move forward if you do a meeting. So if you do a meeting, here is your checklist. Make sure that you prepare a slide deck to guide the conversation in the FDA. Decide ahead of time who's taking the meeting minutes, and it's important to take really good notes. I always dedicate one person from my team, and usually somebody that's not even involved with that project, to take the notes, because they can focus, and they're not going to be worried about, you know, how to respond or who's responding or the whole dynamics of the meeting. Choose who is the presenter for each slide or each topic you want to cover. And their content should be limited, and they should have practiced what they want to say and what they anticipate the FDA asking, and how that interaction is going to go. Make sure that you're ready to listen and compromise and value their time, because you're going to have 60 minutes on the dot. In terms of meeting management, the meeting minutes should be a summary, not a transcript of the meeting. You have to provide these to the FDA within 15 days. There are no recordings allowed, either video or audio. That's the other reason why you do not need to turn in something that feels like a transcript to FDA. And then you submit the minutes as an amendment to the PRESUB through the appropriate document control center within 15 days. Document control centers, if you do the e-copy, they do accept them through the portal. The last time I did one, if you did the Prestar. So it's important to remember, if you are having a meeting, do not repeat your PRESUB comment. Everybody has read your PRESUB ad nauseum at this point, and you are going to waste your time if you try to give any background or context that had already been discussed in your pre-submission. Don't expect FDA to consult on your pre-submission. They will not tell you what to do or necessarily tell you their opinions that are not directly related to the topics under discussion. Don't introduce new topics to that point, or questions. So this is not the time to ask clarification questions, and it's not the time to broach new subjects. You will have to do all that in a subsequent pre-submission. And then don't let the inventor talk too much. If your inventor insists on being at the meeting, you know, again, I mentioned something earlier about being in love with your own science, and that can derail a conversation with the FDA, because again, these are supposed to be very pointed follow-up questions and topics specifically related to information that you have already provided and responses that they've already given.
There's a poll question showing on the screen or not?
No.
No, I messed that one up. Okay.
Would you like to redo it now?
I'm gonna try. Sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, it won't launch. Okay. Well, that's weird.
Try just troubleshooting, and then I'll just keep going here.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
No problem. So the FDA never forgets. So don't try to hide or ignore any previous pre-submissions with the FDA, and don't try to resubmit obviously old data, because they don't look at data, but maybe old protocols or old ideas or questions. Because, and the reason this is important, I have gotten, there we go, there's the next poll question.
You can just talk over the poll question.
Okay. So I have gotten customers that were new to me, but they had been in business, you know, one of those famous, you know, 10, 15-year-old startup situations. And they had, I found out during the data and document dump that they gave me, that they had had not one, not two, but 3 pre-submissions with the FDA over those course of years before they hired me. They did not mention this when they hired me or in our initial kickoff meetings. And then when I found these pre-submissions, I'm like, what's going on here, guys? And they're like, well, we didn't think that they were relevant anymore because we have made changes to the product, to the technology, to the intended use. So we don't feel like we need to address those anymore. Okay. Looks like there are a lot of people who are new to this process, new or early on in their experiences. So, so we did the best we could, kind of, you know, picking this up midstream and trying to move it forward based off of, you know, the constraints given by the client. And we tried to address those things to the best we could at this point. But the FDA knew about every one of those 3 pre-submissions along the way and blew the dust off of them, pulled them back out, and asked them about every question that the client told me was now irrelevant, because they expected that the client had addressed their previous feedback. And if they feel like it was irrelevant, why it was irrelevant. They also felt like, well, some of the context of our concerns are still relevant. Even if you've changed your technology, we still want that question answered about your product now. So just be aware of that. If you get feedback that you didn't like and you go and you make changes, that's context with the FDA is not going to go away. So moving on to 513Gs, or requests for information. Now this is like a cousin to the pre-submission. 513G's functionality was added just recently to the Prestar template. And in March of this year, it is still voluntary. In this case, you will select request for feedback or information, so the RFI, and then you can request the type of submission, or the type of submission that you're looking for. So when to do a RFI or a 513G? Well, you would typically do it when it's difficult to find an exact predicate and you don't feel like you have a good argument for a predicate device, but or you don't feel like you clearly fit in with an existing product code or FDA regulation. So in that case, it might be appropriate to do this request for information, because that's the pathway where FDA does more specific designation requests. And so there are 2 mechanisms depending on what you're looking for. Option 1 is kind of quick and informal. You send an email with some specific but abbreviated information to device determination at fda.hhs.gov. Option 2 is to submit a formal 513G request that is a much more specified content, different level and detail of the content. This does have a fee. It is $62.50 for normal businesses and $32.64 for small businesses for this fiscal year. Now, option 1, while it might sound intriguing, just be prepared that the information you get out of this may or may not be of any type of level of detail or decision to be helpful. And at the end of it, they may just say, hey, submit a 513G if you really want to know. So types of questions that could be appropriate to ask is the product subject to FDA regulations at all? In this case, it might be, is it a device or not a device? Is it general wellness? Looking for some kind of formal determination around that. What is the appropriate regulatory pathway? Is the product exempt for 510K? You would ask this question in the event, like say, maybe you had something that the product code that exists for it is class 1 510K exempt, but maybe you have different technological features, or you added software or something of that nature, or an indication, and that might have taken you out of what FDA intended for the exemptions around that product. Is the product subject to FDA regulations at all? So what is the appropriate, I need to call that. So an example of a question that we have asked in 513G is, does the FDA concur that marketing the device only under the specific product code is appropriate with a proposed revised intended use statement, along with other revisions indicated above, without further submission to the FDA? The FDA does not concur. Could the agency please explain? So here we like make a little, we pose the questions with some context and a little bit more of a statement, and then do you concur? If the FDA does not concur, what type of 510K and which product code would be needed to submit to meet the requirements? 513Gs are also perfect for combination products, where you might have a drug and device, device and biologic, or, you know, the trifecta, drug, device, and a biologic. And in this case, this is going to end up, you know, kind of through the OCP for them to determine who's going to be the lead reviewer for these types of products. The lead reviewer is going to depend on the primary mode of action, which is the primary way that the product accomplishes its therapeutic action. So it's possible for a product to include a drug, but the primary mode of action for the product is a device, as opposed to the therapeutic action of the drug. So that's when 513Gs could also be appropriate. So in their timeline, the FDA's clock days are 60 calendar days. And then once the FDA makes a determination, if they determine that there is a suitable regulation number and a product code, and you can bring your product to market underneath this particular pathway, your device is then going to be eligible to serve as a predicate once it gets through whatever the appropriate submission pathway is. Benefits of the 513G is that the decision is binding with the FDA, and it can be leveraged in future submissions should the subsequent review pathway be in question. So, however, if you receive feedback that you didn't want, that could present a challenge for your future pathway. Here are some references around the 513G for your future. Now, here's something interesting about the 513G versus the pre-submission program. So we do have fees around 513Gs, where around pre-submissions we do not. However, around pre-submissions, even though they are free, they have a metric associated with them to where the FDA, because of the MDUFA commitments, gets measured on how often do they meet their timelines for the pre-submission commitments. There are no metrics for 513Gs, even though you're paying them good money in which they could they have funding to resource themselves for these reviews. So because there's no internal metric, our experience with 513Gs is that these are running 10 to 12 months for a review time, and they're supposed to be 60 days. So that just tells you the good old fashioned or the classic statement, what gets measured gets managed, and what gets measured gets done. So just keep that in mind if you're doing a 513G.
Launched a last poll question. Appreciate everyone's participation. As I mentioned earlier, somebody had the brilliant idea of handing out certificates of attendance. And so if you drop your name and email address into the chat, then I'll make sure that you get one. Thought that was cool. Yeah. Show. Let's just let this run a little bit longer and then we'll get back to your regularly scheduled program. Michelle, it looks like there are 18 questions in the Q&A.
Sweet.
And a lot of people have requested the certificate. So Fra's going to be busy.
Okay. Well, I'll kind of pick up the pace a little bit here so I can take the questions. So let's see here. How confident are you? Okay, most people are somewhat confident. We've got a handful that are very confident, and then a few that are not confident. Hopefully we'll be building those confidence levels by the time we finish here. So the Breakthrough Devices Request, or BDD, versus Safer Technologies Program, or STEP. Let's compare and contrast those. So first, we have to understand FDA's definition of novel technology is that it has the potential to lead to a clinical improvement in the diagnosis, cure, treatment, prevention, mitigation of a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating disease or condition. This is how they describe novel technology, which is the foundation of the Breakthrough Device Request. The Breakthrough Device is designed to streamline the market clearance and approval process for novel medical devices, as per that definition we just talked about. It is a two-step process. The process got started in 2015, and the program is gaining popularity and maturing over the years. And you can see that when it initially, this is the number of breakthrough devices granted when it initially got kicked off, was a very slow start. And then COVID, it kind of shot up, and then it's kind of mellowing back out post-COVID. As far as who's getting breakthrough designations, you know, it's primarily cardiovascular, neurologic, and orthopedic review divisions. So is your device eligible? The first criteria you have to demonstrate is that the device provides for more effective treatment of that life-threatening and irreversibly debilitating condition. There are 4 criteria, and you have to prove at least one, but you need to make a case for as many as you possibly can in your argument. That's my recommendation, at least, but one has to be really, really solid. So it represents that breakthrough technology per the definition we just discussed. There are no approved or cleared alternatives. It offers significant advantages over existing approved or cleared alternatives, or the device availability is in the best interest of patients. And you have to meet both criteria. So what happens if your breakthrough is denied? Well, you can go about your merry way and do the standard filing of whatever you were going to do before, be it a de novo or a PMA. Or possibly if you feel like there could be an argument for the Safer Technologies program, you can go that way and then proceed with your submission. So the Safer Technologies program is a bit like a fraternal twin to the breakthrough device. The arguments are very similar with a different nuance. So this is focused on the device offers significant safety benefits for non-life-threatening or reasonably reversible conditions that are less serious than those that are intended for the Breakthrough Devices program. If we look at the data, there's not as much data around the STEP authorizations. It is a newer program than the Breakthrough Device. So the information we have is from the CDRH annual report. As of October of 2023, there are a total of 35 devices in the STEP program since its inception. And of those 35, 15 were enrolled in 2023. And only 2 of the 35 have made it through the STEP process and were authorized for marketing. So that just shows you, you know, companies think that the STEP and the breakthrough are going to be maybe a faster program for them. Well, if that was true, you would think that we would have more of those 20 devices that were in the program prior to 2023 should have been made it out of that queue. More than 2 should have made it out of the queue by the end of the fiscal year. Is your device eligible for a STEP? So the first criteria is you are not eligible through the Breakthrough Devices program, be that because you were denied for it, or you just know that you don't meet that life-threatening, debilitating definition or the definition of novel. The second criteria is similar but slightly different in that it focuses on a reduction in the occurrence of like serious adverse events, device failures, use errors, or an improvement in the safety of an alternative device or intervention, which could include even a drug intervention. The process for application for both of them is the same. You start with that Q submission. Both of them are free. You go through your application process. You address your 2 criteria. And then within 30 days from the receipt of the request, FDA is supposed to ask you for additional information that they may need to factor into their decision. Then within 60 days, they are supposed to make a decision on if your device meets the criteria of either program. If it's granted, you move through your submission process and you go on, but with the special tools that you get through one of these programs. If it's denied, you just, you can apply for STEP, or you can just move through your submission strategy like you would have without having this program. The special program features that you can request in the scope of your BDD or STEP application include a sprint discussion, a data development plan, and then there are other handful of very specific things that you can request. But the clinical protocol agreement is only an option if you have a BDD. So the advantages just in general of the program is that this includes regular updates from the FDA during your submission and your submission development, more informal and timely interactions with the FDA. And then, so this is supposed to lead to the potential for the shorter time to market than your standard review process. So those strategic advantages of those benefits are that the FDA intends that these programs are going to provide a high level of engagement between FDA and innovators, where there are no good alternatives to patients. And at the end of the BDD process, when you finally get granted or clearance or approval, whatever pathway you ended up on, FDA like puts out an actual kind of press release of FDA worked with this company to bring this important technology to market. So it could be really good for marketing purposes. So this is just for your reference later to compare the 2 technologies and the benefits. So here's some of my lessons learned. When is it appropriate to have multiple PRESUBs? Well, when you have multiple really in-depth topics to cover, like clinical, bench, and regulatory strategy. So combining these might compromise the depth or quality of review that you are seeking. So I would typically break this up where maybe I submit like a test plan or my test selection confirmation and why I selected those, get FDA to concur with the test plan, and then at a later date, submit the test protocols and say, hey, remember, we've already got your buy-in with the test plan itself. do you agree that these test methodologies and acceptance criteria are going to be appropriate to meet your needs? And then I would do clinical questions in a totally separate pre-sub. So I would typically not put clinical with any other type of question because it requires such specific feedback in the FDA from the FDA reviewers and specific group that I would kind of keep that one segregated from the other types of questions I'm asking. This is really important to know. There is an FDA guidance document on Q-subs, and in it, Appendix 2 talks about example pre-sub questions, and it tells you how to specifically, like, these are concepts that are going to lead to the most valuable feedback from the agency. So it gives you kind of a structure of how to structure your pre-sub. It also has very specific questions, and by reading the question in a huge number of topics that are just ideas of questions that you could ask that would lead to a profitable discussion with the FDA. And so you can kind of read between the lines about how the question's structured, what type of attachments need to be included for appropriate discussion with the FDA. So just, again, more examples of questions here. This guidance document is being revised. It is in draft as of March of this year. One of the more interesting new sections in it is that there's a clarification on informal interactions that could occur outside the Q submission program. And some of these examples are fascinating. They even have questions. I don't know why you would ask this question. That is their example in there of things that you could ask the FDA in just an email or a one-off type of interaction. And some of this is all new content in this draft. So it also talks about written feedback versus clarification meetings. And it specifies, even though FDA is kind of doing this in practice, that a clarification email or clarification call are separate than your formal written feedback. And it has several examples of those. But the problem is if you don't already have a lead reviewer and you want to ask one of these informal questions, it's not clear who to ask, who to send that question to. And again, there are no metrics for response time here. So not only do we not know who to send it to, but when to expect a response. Here's another recommendation of mine. Use the FDA originated verbiage. So if you can possibly quote something out of a guidance document to support your case, be that a Q submission guidance document, a product specific guidance document, or a feature specific guidance, or a standard like for sterility, biocompatibility, packaging, so on and so forth. Do that. The FDA specifically told me in a review, we really need you to use our own words so we know how you meet our requirements. Here's an example where, and this is a difference where we had written feedback, and then we were able to have a subsequent clarification meeting where the reviewers actually showed up, not just an email. In the written feedback, we got kind of a odd response that said silicone was carcinogenic and all these things, and that we recommend that you just justify this material with biocompatibility testing. And so it's like, okay, we already proposed biocompatibility testing. What else do you want? And it turned out that the reviewer who gave this question was an anesthesiologist, practicing anesthesiologist, not the biocompatibility or toxicologist expert on the team. And in the meeting, the actual FDA reviewer was like, yeah, we understand but yes, the way the testing you proposed is appropriate to mitigate that concern. And the FDA said, we understand, and we don't have any further clinical concerns specifically about that statement from that reviewer. that clinical reviewer. This is another interesting one where I ran up against, you know, two different things about this one. First, the FDA said, well, we disagree with your choice of the predicate because internally we have information that's not publicly available to so that you would not know that we don't think that that's an appropriate predicate. Well, what are we supposed to do for a substantial equivalence argument when we're bound to the information that's publicly available? The other feedback that we got on this particular one is that the feedback came from a particular group of clinical doctors that only practiced in women's anatomy. And this product was specific to men's anatomy. And the clinical experts we had on our side were all for men's anatomy. And they're like, well, the FDA people said, well, we learned about men's anatomy in school. Doesn't matter that we hadn't practiced in it. So just be aware that there could be these challenges of your review team if you get some squirrely feedback. Multi-office interactions can be challenging, especially if FDA is going through a lot right now between, what are they going to do with the IVD division versus the device division. And we've seen them kind of duke it out within a pre-submission discussion where we were like kind of flies on the wall watching it all go down. This is important. I have gotten a lot of feedback lately when I've done pre-submissions that we really think this would have been more appropriate to ask in a 513G instead of a pre-submission. And they said this even when I verbatim took the question out of the suggested questions for appropriate interactions or feedback from the agency. So if you get something like this where it specifically contradicts something that is in an FDA guidance document, be aware there are a lot of new reviewers that don't really know these guidance documents as well as somebody in industry that does as many of these a year as we do. And you might need to get their supervisor involved or the ombudsman involved and escalate this if it's not following FDA policy and procedure. So your secrets to success: plan out not just your submission strategy, but your pre-submission strategy. How do you want to group your questions? How many of them do you want to have? How does it affect your timelines? Don't rely on pre-submissions alone as the only tool to get the feedback that you need with the new pathways that have opened up. And don't expect to get the feedback that you expected, especially all under one pathway or avenue. Be clear on who is your contact person, especially if you're using a consultant, because I've seen the FDA copy one group of people and not the other group of people. Then the first group of people didn't forward it to the second group of people, and it led to some complicated interactions. And then don't overload your pre-submission with too many topics or questions. Here are the helpful links for your reference for everything we talked about today. And then you can visit my website if you want some of my tools and tips and tricks and resources that are available. So now we can.
That's great. Thank you so much, Michelle. We have 26 questions. We got to none of them. And we've run a little bit over, so I know people have other things to do. But I want to thank you again, and I want to thank everyone who attended. As I mentioned in the chat, we'll try to get back to the questions. We will create those certificates. This is the first time I've ever done this, so please be patient with me. Yeah, are we done? We're done.
Yeah, so I will answer all your questions and follow up via email. So I do apologize. It was a action-packed hour, and I just want to be respectful of everybody's time going forward, but I will answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.